Today, Marsha is here to talk about her latest novel, Traitors Among Us. So with the Brantford Public Library, I'd like to welcome Marsha Skrypuch.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I always love to speak from the Brantford Public Library, even though I'm in my office room upstairs. But see, I have a fake library right there behind me so that you think that I'm in the library, because I learned how to read at the Brantford Public Library. So for me, I have a warm spot in my heart always for the Brantford Public Library. When I learned how to read, I was 9 years old, and I have dyslexia. So I couldn't read when I was in school, and I was identified as being a slow learner, which I don't, like this is the 1960s, and so they were pretty brutal with identities back then. And actually, my mother was told that I would never be a success in life, would never learn how to read, and that it was all her fault because my parents were divorced. And so I couldn't get help in school. And so I went to the local public library, and I didn't like the kids' books because they seemed too simple to me and not interesting. So I went up to the second floor of the old Brantford Public Library, and the librarian there, I told her what I wanted, that I wanted a big fat book that would take me a long time to read, but at least it would look like I was smart because I was holding a big book. And she said, well, this is the adult department. You're only 9 years old and you can't read, but I'll take you downstairs and I'll show you where there are big fat books for you. And so that was my first introduction to children's novels, but also novels for all ages that are appropriate for kids. And so the first novel that I read was Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. And it took me a year. And the reason that I could read that instead of Sea Spot Run and The Cat in the Hat, which actually gave me nightmares, is because there was a story, and it was a really meaningful story. And it was about a young person plunged in a time of distress and despair who had to figure out his own solutions to his problems. And so it really spoke to me because that's how I felt I was at the time. I was this kid who had the world against me. And it also, reading that book at the Brantford Public Library, made me into the writer that I am, because that's the kind of book that I always write. A lot of kids will ask me, what's so great about war? Why do you always write about war? And it's not that I write about war. I write about resilient young people and young people who are stuck in a time of challenge and how they live up to that challenge. To me, that is the most intensely interesting thing in my life. A few years ago, I never would have dreamed that I would have written Traitors Among Us. And the reason is because after writing my first World War II trilogy, which was Making Bombs for Hitler, Stolen Girl, also published as Stolen Child, and Underground Soldier, also published as The War Below, I really felt that I couldn't go to World War II anymore. It takes a lot out of me emotionally to write on these topics. But then I had an experience where a woman approached me while I was sitting in the audience at an event for another author. And she had come to this event specifically to meet me. And that was Irina Korpan. And she gave me her card, and she also said, can you please consider writing a book about my mother? And I ended up writing the book because it was a story of World War II that had not been told before. I don't write stories unless they haven't been told. It's just this thing. If I want to read about a topic and I can find a novel about a topic, for me, reading and writing it engages the same part of my brain. And so I'll read the book, but if I can't find a novel that has taken that topic, then I write it. So I wrote a book about Christia and her mother. And in World War II, they hid 3 Jewish friends underneath their kitchen floor. That book was published as Don't Tell the Enemy in Canada. And then it was picked up by Scholastic in the US as well. And I met with my editor for lunch there. And she said to me, please tell me that this is the book 1 of a trilogy. I hadn't planned it being book 1 of a trilogy. Also because Don't Tell the Enemy was very much based on what Christia and her family had lived through. And so like to continue on a story, there's privacy issues, all sorts of different issues. But I said yes, because wouldn't you? And so it was published in the States as Don't Tell the Nazis. And now this is the version. The other thing that was just driving me nuts, though, about having books published in Canada and then published in the States was they kept on changing the titles. And so when the next book came out, which was Trapped in Hitler's Web, by this time, the two publishers and my agent had been able to agree that all the books up till like from then on would always have the same titles. And so the next book in the series was Trapped in Hitler's Web. So what I did with this book was I took Maria, the younger sister from Don't Tell the Nazis, because Don't Tell the Nazis is from Christia's point of view. But I had put Maria into Austria as a slave laborer, even though the real Maria didn't do that. They did have a relative who did that, but it wasn't the younger sister. And I did that. Those of you who are writers know exactly why I did that. If you have two sisters who are similar in age in a story, it makes it really murky when you're writing a story. So it's better to have a single person in that narrative. So I did that, but that also gave me the opportunity to write about another experience in World War II, and actually one that was really similar to a lot of people that I knew, because whereas Making Bombs for Hitler was about the slave labor experience from people who became Ostarbeiters, the Eastern workers, and it was very brutal. There are a lot of people in Canada whose grandparents and great-grandparents were slave laborers from Western Ukraine, and it was a different experience altogether, including my own father-in-law. And so Trapped in Hitler's Web is about that. It's a completely different slave labor experience than what's in Making Bombs for Hitler. In the third book, Traitors Among Us, I started where most people would think the story ended. So, you know, World War II ends happily ever after. Not. Especially if you're Ukrainian, it didn't end there. And the reason is that most people were able to go back to their country, reclaim a life. But for Ukrainians, the country didn't exist anymore because during the talks between the Allies, the Allied nations, the Soviet Union asked for where Ukraine was, wanted it back. It wasn't theirs to ask back for, but they got it. And so it became Soviet territory. So it's not like you were going home again. It was like you were going back into the war, because for Ukrainians, the Soviets and the Nazis, there's really not too much difference because they wanted to kill the people who lived there. So I started the book, Traitors Among Us, at a time when Christia and Maria are together, they're safe, they're in an American refugee camp after the war. It could have been the end of a book, right? But then what happens is the door bursts open and Soviet soldiers come in and start picking off people who thought that they were safe to take them back to the Soviet zone for interrogation and questioning, because they have identified these people as being enemies of their country. And it's not, they didn't have to do anything. Basically, Stalin considered anybody who survived World War II, who was Ukrainian or Eastern European from those captured nations, to be an enemy and also a future potential enemy. So it's not like they were punishing people who did something. They were looking for people who could be a problem in the future. And so my girls are taken with a bunch of other people in a truck to the Soviet zone, where they are interrogated, and they may end up in a gulag, in a concentration camp in the Soviet North, or there were also camps that they had put up right in what was at that time occupied Germany. So that's what the story is about. And the research that I do, we can talk about it. I hope that you ask questions about that. But right now I'm going to stop because I'm hoping that there are questions for me.
Hi, Marsha. I have a question here from Karen, and it says, why do you write your books as historical fiction instead of narrative nonfiction, since it's all factually based?
That is an excellent question. Thank you, Karen. I write some of my books as narrative nonfiction and some of my books as historical fiction. So the difference for me is if I can speak to the actual person who is in the book, and I can okay dialogue that I put in their mouths, then I can write it as narrative nonfiction. So for example, Sky of Bombs, Sky of Stars, which is about Tuyette from Brantford, by the way, who was an airlift orphan, though that this is an omnibus edition of what had originally been published as Last Airlift and One Step at a Time. Tuyette is alive and kicking, and so I could read her every single word that I wrote about her life. She could approve it. I also interviewed her family. I interviewed the pilot of the plane when she was airlifted out of Saigon, as at the fall of Saigon. So I felt that I could call it narrative nonfiction. I also did the same thing with Adrift at Sea, which is about Tuan, who's a 6-year-old boy who escaped from Vietnam in 1980 with his mother and older sisters as boat people, because I could talk to him and I could talk to the sisters. And I also co-wrote the book with his sister, Van, who was left behind because the whole family escaped. But then at the last minute, the human smugglers refused to take the little girl and the grandmother. So they were left behind. And so with those books, I can call it narrative nonfiction. But when you're writing about World War II, and you're also talking about a place that most of the people in the story have passed away, I don't have the moral authority to put words into someone's mouths. And I don't feel that I can tell a whole story if I can't have multiple characters. And so what I do is I use memoirs, letters, government documents, all different sources to create characters. And so everything that happened to someone, but they're my created characters, because I think that that gives a more balanced view than trying to only stick to the narrative that the people who survived could contribute to my interviews. So it's a fuller way of doing it as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so just a quick reminder to everyone, questions, if you want to type your question, put it in the Q&A, not in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can let you talk, okay? All right, I think we have one person here, Ms. Baker's grade 7.
Hello, can you hear us?
Hello?
Can you hear us?
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead.
I have a question. How long does it take to write one of your books? And what type of schooling?
So it takes a long time to write a book, and it's a good thing that I'm old, because like I've written 25 books, and my first book was published in 1996. But I had started writing when I was in grade 8. And, you know, for the first long time, I had written books that just never got published. And then once my books started getting published, they were published once a year, but it's not like it only took me a year to write a book. So it usually takes a couple of years to do the research. But while I'm doing the research, I can be doing the research for more than one book, because, you know, you might be able to interview someone for one book and interview someone for a different book 2 days apart from each other. But it takes about a year or more to do the research. To do the first draft, if I write 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, then I can write a first draft usually in 6 months. Then the rewrites, when the rewrites start, that is, I would say, another year is set aside for the rewrites. And then after that, it's easier because you have edits that come in from the publisher, but they're minor compared to those big things. So it is very intensive, and it's especially intensive now for me because I'm in the wonderful situation of having publishers who want to publish me. And Scholastic would like a book every year, but here I am, it takes me several years to write a book, and they'd like a book every year. So it means that for the book that is upcoming, the book that is coming out this fall, I was doing 9-hour writing days, which I have to tell you is very exhausting. But on the other hand, I only write stories about topics that I'm absolutely passionate about. I'm not going to waste my time writing a story that I consider trivial. It's just not what I want to do. And so for me, this is the place that I want to be. I'm happiest when I'm complaining about a 9-hour writing day.
That's great. Your next question is from Anne-Marie Myers. How do you do your research for the extent that it comes across so realistic?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's a great question. So one of the things that I try to find out is what a 24-hour day looks like for my character before everything changed and then once everything changed. Because what you're writing about is when there was a huge change, a transformation, whether the war started, whether, you know, like something happened, right? And so the way that you find out a 24-hour day, first of all, you can do a brainstorm, and then you can just ask yourself what's different for this person compared to me. You know, you get up in the morning, they get up in the morning, you might have breakfast. What do they do? If they're starving, they don't have breakfast. What do they do? They may not be wearing the same kind of clothing as you. They may not keep it in the same place. So if you think of yourself and the difference between you and your character, that starts you. But then you have to find out how to fill in all those blanks. And so I use personal memoirs. I use interviews with people if they're still alive and ask them things like that. So what do you do first thing in the morning? And I take them through a day. But I also try and find personal memoirs, letters, and all that kind of thing that will answer those questions for me. So once I have the template of a 24-hour day before the change and after the change, this helps me tremendously. And I also, while I'm doing that, I have these aha moments because I don't really know what the book is about myself until my character tells me. So leaving myself open to find out what they're encountering day to day helps a lot. That also means that I have to know what they're seeing, what they're feeling, what they're eating, where they go to the bathroom, what their underwear looks like, all these things, how they make their food. It's different for them than for us because, you know, they're in a different time.
Thanks, Marsha. Your next question comes from Stephen Stone's Community School, grade 7-8. What inspired you to write these books?
So what inspired me to write these books is that I hated reading when I was a kid. And part of the reason I hated reading when I was a kid is because I feel that a lot of the books that were available to me in the 1960s, because like I'm 66 years old, so I was a kid in the 1960s. I felt that they assumed that I was not a smart person and that I couldn't handle a good book. And I feel that I want to write books that I would have loved to be able to read when I was a kid, books that respected me as an intelligent human being. So what I do, I write for young people because I respect young people's intelligence, and I write the books that I love to read myself and the books that I feel haven't been written yet. And so that is what draws me to a story, is the gaps in history that people have ignored. And a lot of times they ignore them for really awful reasons. It's for political reasons or because something's being covered up. And so that appeals to me. But like, truly, I write about what I write about because these things interest me.
Okay, thank you. Ms. I believe Ms. Baker's class has one more question.
We actually have two questions, if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Which book would have been your most enjoyable writing experience?
Well, so enjoyable, do you mean the one that was fun to write? It's, for me, it's easier to write narrative nonfiction than fiction because the research is simpler because everybody is alive. And so I would have to say writing the books about Tuyet Yushchishin from Brantford, Last Airlift and One Step at a Time, that's now republished as Sky of Bombs, Sky of Stars, was probably the most fun book because Tuyet is just such a special person. And being able to meet with her, becoming a friend, having her as a friend has been very meaningful to me. But it was also simpler because I didn't have to go into deep, dark archives to do the books. And so in some ways, it was almost a holiday from deep research, because when I'm doing World War II novels or World War I novels, it takes tremendous amount of archival research to be able to replicate those stories. And also remember that Stalin destroyed a lot of records. I mean, in addition to all the people that he killed, he also destroyed records. So to be able to replicate what has been intentionally destroyed is a lot of work. And it's also really sad, whereas Tuyette's story was uplifting because she was rescued, and her family is just so inspiring. I really admire her parents and her sisters and her brother. And so there's this different thing where you're writing something that is easier to access in terms of research.
Thank you. Next question comes from Kate Blair. How hard do you find it to make historical events fit a satisfying narrative structure? Great question.
That is a great question. And of course, it comes from a wonderful writer who knows all the struggles of doing that sort of thing. I try not to overthink my characters, and I try not to overthink the scenes. So what I use as my template for a story is the actual history. And so that's kind of in the background where I have this overall structure of what actually happens in history. And for any given book that I write, I usually find one book that I would call my Bible that has a chronology of the actual historical events. And so for Traitors Among Us, it was hard because no one has written about the special camps and the interrogation camps. So I had to find letters and government documents and everything that had date stamps on them so that it gives me a template to have when my characters did what. Now, there was one huge date that helped me organize and structure what my characters were going through. And that was that when the war ended, the American forces overtook a zone that they were not supposed to be in. So they overtook by about 60 miles into Soviet territory because they wanted to take the scientists and everything for Operation Paperclip. So they wanted all the Nazi scientists on the American side and not the Soviet side. And when that happened, had huge impact on my girls in their interrogation camp. So all these outside forces have a lot to do with how my characters react and who they become. So oftentimes I'll write an entire narrative, and it won't be until the last page that I think, I have my character wrong. I forgot that she is X. And then I have to go back and I have to build that character that's key to her in there that she didn't tell me until the last because she was too shy to let me know that this was one of her key characteristics. So I leave myself open for the characters to tell me who they are rather than me put it on them.
Sorry, Elena, did you have a chat you were going to do? I didn't want to.
My apologies. Ms. Baker's class has one more question.
Sure.
You guys can go ahead and ask your question.
This is coming from my one student, Evan. He's asking, what type of schooling do you suggest for somebody that wants to become a writer?
Great question. One thing that I would suggest, if you want to be a writer, first off, think of another career as well, because you can't go to school to become a writer like other things. And also, if you do something else in addition to being a writer, it gives you a richness in background. You get to meet other people and gives you something to write about. But there's something that you can start to do today. And I would suggest all of you, anyone who is an aspiring writer, or even if you just want to write well and not be a writer, this is something that you should do. First thing is you should try to set yourself a goal of reading 1,000 books. For me, my goal when I was a kid was to read 1,000 novels. Read as wide of a range as possible. The reason that you want to do that and why that is part of an education for a writer is because if you don't read a whole pile, and then you start writing, you're just going to sound like the last person you read. So you need to develop a voice. And that's why people have a favorite author. It's because they love the voice of that author, and it's unique. So it's not rules and regulations about writing, it's that they have read enough to pick and choose what they really like and what they don't like, and figure out for themselves what's unique to them and is their voice. The other thing that I would suggest for anyone who wants to be a writer when they get older is to start writing today. Because like I hear a lot of people who say things like, when on the summer holidays, I'm going to start writing. Or, old people like me will say, when I retire, I'm going to write a book. It doesn't happen because there's never a good time to write. Let me tell you, I've been writing 9-hour days. There's no good time to start doing that. So what you need to do is to set aside every single day 10 minutes. And the 10 minutes are for writing. And it's when you first start it, you'll stare at a blank page and say, what am I doing? Because I have no idea what I'm writing. But what will happen is after a while, within those 10 minutes, the whole rest of your day will be geared towards perceiving the world differently so that you know what to write in those 10 minutes. That actually changes your brain chemistry and makes you into a writer. Now, for those 10-minute a day writings that you do, it shouldn't be homework. It shouldn't be for you to show adults so that they praise you. It has nothing to do with praise. It has nothing to do with people saying, aren't you smart? It has something to do with your soul, so that you learn yourself what's important to you to write. But if you write for 10 minutes every single day, by the end of a year, you'll have something that's like this thick. It won't be a novel and it's not going to be a book, but you will have learned how to be a writer and to create story almost by osmosis, just by sitting down and doing that so consistently.
Thank you, Marsha. Your next question is from Natalie Regato. Are all your books about war? And this is from grade 6-7 here in Brantford.
Oh, a Brantford person. This is great because there's going to be a book draw for people from Brantford, autographed books. So not every single book that I've written is about war. For example, I wrote When Mama Goes to Work, no war. It's really little, because how much can me, the war writer, write about something that isn't set during war? I also wrote this book, The Best Gifts. It's a baby book, no war. But generally, the reason that I write about war is because, and Ms. Regato, don't take this the wrong way, I could follow you around all day and I could write down every single thing that you did. It might be a boring book, right? But what if I followed you around every single day and wrote about everything that you did, and all of a sudden we had a war in Brantford? All of a sudden, I don't know, Poughkeepsie attacked Brantford. And so the students in your school were hiding under their desks and there wasn't enough water, and maybe there was an explosion somewhere, and you had to organize people to make sure that they would survive. Wouldn't that be a more interesting thing to write about? So what I like to do is to write about regular people, but in extraordinary times. And I'm not interested in like the presidents and the leaders and the prime ministers and the sergeants and all that kind of thing. I'm interested in regular people on the ground whose lives are affected by war. And that is generally something that is avoided. But to me, that is the most interesting.
Next comes from Donna Young. Hello from DePere Middle School in DePere, Wisconsin, I believe. What inspired you to become a writer?
So that's a great question, and thank you for that. I am dyslexic, and so the way that I think and the way that I decode the world is probably different than people who don't have the gift of dyslexia, and I do consider it a gift now. I decode the world in images and story, and so for me to not write story would be really hard. It would be like if you had a big pimple on your face and you couldn't squeeze it, how hard that would be for you. That's how hard it is for me to not write a story that I really, really, really want to write. And people will say to me, even like, I'm doing this, I just finished the third rewrite of my big novel for the fall of 2022, and they say, how can you do that? Are you going to take a break now? Why don't you retire? And I'm thinking, like, I just can't imagine doing that, because this is the thing that brings me joy, is to step into the shoes of someone else and to understand what they had to live through. It makes me appreciate my life, because I realized how fortunate I am, but it also is a way for me to honor people who came before me and the struggles that they went through, so that we could have freedom and the kind of life that we have today.
Next question is from Karen Audio. Audio, I apologize. How did working on this book during the pandemic affect your writing?
It's been more difficult to research, that's for sure. Oh, and Making Seeker by Karen Audio. I haven't started it yet, but I'm waiting to read this book. And so if you're looking for a book to read, I would suggest that you look at Karen Audio's Making Seeker, brand new book out. But it's harder to do research because I couldn't interview people face to face. I couldn't get, the biggest thing for me was to get newspaper archives, because the one newspaper that I needed to access was only available at York University archives. So I couldn't do it. So I had to come up with all sorts of different ways of doing research. One thing that helped a lot, though, was a lot of academics who would normally not be available to me, they were bored to tears. And so like I did some, face-to-face stuff through Skype and Zoom with researchers who made themselves available to me just probably out of sheer boredom. So that helped. But I am a librarian by profession. I have my master's degree in library science. And so I do know how to do database research using library databases. So I had access to a lot of various academic and public and different libraries, and I would use their databases, which is completely different than Google, let me tell you, because I don't consider just Googling something to be research at all. But I had to rely on that kind of thing a lot more than being able to go into an archive and like looking at especially the newspapers. It was hard. And let me tell you, there are other, like you can get a lot of newspapers online. It was just that this particular one, you couldn't get it any other way except through microform.
So next we still have about 15 questions. So E. Grande, what about the story of the Underground Soldier, Jeremy, grade 8?
So Underground Soldier is the same book as The War Below. And so this book is very much related to Traitors Among Us, because when I wrote Underground Soldier, and then it became published after that subsequently as The War Below, I had about 10,000 words in the story, which that's about 50 pages. That was all about Soviets capturing civilians after the war and taking them to the Soviet zone. And that ended up being cut out of that version of the book because my publisher felt that it was off on a tangent and it could be a book on its own. So I set that aside. I didn't use any of that again, but that became the seed for Traitors Among Us, because that's what this entire book is about. But like that's the thing about writing historical fiction, is you think you're writing like this, and then you have a thing that goes like that, and then another one that goes like that, and they go all over the place. And as you prune them, then you get other books. And so my publishers, I don't know, like they're very patient with me, because I always tell them I'm writing one book and then I always have 3. And they just sigh and smile and support me, which is very nice. But it's in the nature of a story that it's like, a Medusa's head, and they've got things all over the place. But Underground Soldier was very special to me in particular because the person that I based Luca on lives just 20 minutes away from me. And he gave me his personal papers about his story as a soldier in the underground, in the Ukrainian insurgent army. And he also read the manuscript over for me for accuracy. But he also helped me access so much different like primary data, because he was a professor at McMaster University and he had so many sources and he was just so helpful to me. But this was, again, it was a topic that had never been written on before. I don't think that you'll ever have seen another novel written where the main character is a member of the Ukrainian insurgent army.
Sorry, Val. I'm gonna let Donna speak. She's had her hands raised for a while. Donna, can you hear me? Okay. Doesn't seem her microphone's working. Okay, Val, what's our next question then?
So the next question is from Sylvia McLean. Which book influenced you the most that you remember being your favorite first?
So favorite first that I wrote or favorite first that I read?
It just says favorite first.
So the very first book that was published had it had a profound effect on me, and that was Silver Threads. This is the first edition of Silver Threads. And the first book that I ever wrote was not Silver Threads. The first book that I wrote was this big fat abomination called Shadows in the Sand that had everything plus the kitchen sink in it. And it had too many narratives, too many stories, and I didn't even know how to write from the perspective of a character. And so I had one character speaking through a tape recording where they would just, like, someone would push a tape recorder and their voice would come out. And then I had another person, first person, and then another all through letters. It was just an abomination. But it was 500 pages of story, all these characters set during the Armenian genocide. And I got 100 rejections for that book. So I set it aside. And then one weekend I wrote Silver Threads. And I just assumed that I would get 100 rejections for it too. So I did this thing that authors are not supposed to do, or at that time, aspiring authors are not supposed to do. I sent the manuscript to, I don't know, like a dozen publishers all at once. And for those of you who are not in the publishing industry, to give you a context, it would like being if you asked if you're like 12 people to marry you all at once, all on the same day. That's the same kind of thing that I just did by sending it out to all these publishers at once. But I just thought that they'd all say no, and then I'd send it out to the next 12. Except what happened was 3 of them said yes. And that was a great problem to have, but it was still a problem. So it ended up going to bidding. And I got a literary agent out of it, and then it went to bidding, and then it was Penguin Canada who did this book. And then I ended up on tour. And this is in 1996 when they actually put people in business class on airplanes and put them in fancy hotels. And then you'd get interviewed by radio, and on the front page, like the entertainment section of a newspaper, like a print newspaper. But I'm a very shy person. And so it was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I still remember this one interview that I did with Maclean's magazine, and I could feel sweat dripping down the side of my shirt, just dripping, because I was just so terrified and petrified of this whole thing. And it was sort of like, what did I get myself into? But now I have, Silver Threads taught me something, and it was that you can create characters in addition to the ones that are in the book. So you are meeting a character right now, and the character you're meeting is called Extrovert Marsha. And so I'm not the one that has coffee dribbled down my front t-shirt, and I'm not the one that won't answer the phone. I'm the one that will actually answer your questions and smile and pretend that I'm not nervous. So that's what Silver Threads taught me, was that creating characters goes beyond books.
Okay, our next question, Samara would like to know, what is the favorite book you have authored so far? You may have already kind of answered that, but.
Well, actually, it's a different book. And the book that I have to say is my favorite is Enough. And it's set during the Holodomor. And those of you who are Ukrainian know what the Holodomor is. That means death by hunger. And it's not that I'm happy about people who died by hunger, but when this book came out in 20 years ago, it was the first time a commercial storybook had been published about the Ukrainian famine. And to give you context, what this was before World War II, between the two wars. Stalin, who was the dictator like Hitler, except of the Soviet Union, decided he wanted to get rid of an entire group of people. Just like Hitler wanted to get rid of the Jews, Stalin wanted to get rid of the Ukrainians. He sealed the borders, took all of their food, and waited for them to die. So many died that they couldn't even count them all, because they also killed the census takers. And that has come down in history to be called the Holodomor. But when I wrote this book, it was before it had been even acknowledged by world leaders, by countries. It was, if you talked about it, then you actually risked your life. And so when this book came out, I had hate mail and death threats, to the point that I had to cancel my own son's birthday party because we got a threat on that day. And if I spoke about, did a public presentation, I had to inform the police of that town or city that I was going to be doing that, because they would have to send people out. I don't like that kind of threat. But the thing is when you get that kind of reaction to a book, you know that you're writing about something important. And so after the book had been out for a while, and it was also translated into Ukrainian, it started to be used to teach young people, especially, about the Holodomor. See, the other thing that I did was I kind of made fun of Stalin, which, like, there are people who, they've got like big pictures on their mantle of Stalin because they think he's a good guy, which just shocks me. But here he is. Michael Marchenko did the illustrations, and like, he looks like this brute. And even his horse looks like a bully horse. And so the very fact that I made fun of this person that some people still revere just gave me a lot of grief. But then finally Ukraine had a democratic election. They were able to elect a president democratically, and he contacted me and wanted to meet me and give me an award. And so we did. He came to Canada, and it was Viktor Yushchenko. And you can Google, this isn't research, but you can do it anyway, the Orange Revolution and Ukraine. And here he is, and he's giving me an honor for writing about the Holodomor. And the honor that he's giving me is the Order of Princess Olha. And I have it right here. I'm not allowed to wear it unless I am in the company of prime ministers and presidents and all that, but I can show it to you. Here it is. This is the Order of Princess Olha. Princess Olha was a warrior princess. But so the book that almost got me killed also made me a princess. And so that's why it's my favorite book. And also, those of you who have difficulty pronouncing Marsha Skrypuch, if you see me, you can say, "Hello, Princess Marsha," and I'll go, "Hello."
Okay, next question from Oksana. How your book's been translated into Ukrainian?
So my first World War II trilogy, which includes Stolen Girl and Making Bombs for Hitler and The War Below, they are currently being translated into Ukrainian right now. So they should be available soon. And I'm just so thrilled about that. My books have been translated into many different languages: Korean, Chinese. This is the Chinese edition of Stolen Child. And those of you from Brantford, just take a look at that cover, because this is Winarden Castle, which is on Usher Street in Brantford. This is the Chinese vision of a castle from Brantford, Ontario, which I think is pretty cool. But yes, they will. I have some of my books are now being translated into Ukrainian.
So from Stephenstone's Community School grade 7-8, you've already answered this question about a young person just beginning or interested in starting to be a book writer. So I'm going to skip over that and go to the next one since we have so many, which is great. So from Donna Young, what is your favorite way to start a book?
So I don't start from the beginning, and that's partly because of my gift of dyslexia. I don't have to write in order. So the way that I start is whatever scene is the most vivid in my mind, even before I know my character's personality. I'll write the scene that is vivid. So in Traitors Among Us, it did happen to be the first scene. That scene of the two girls who were in the barracks, and they're looking through the light shining down through the bullet holes in the barracks, and then the door bursts open. But the only reason that was the first scene is because it was the third book in a series. For when I was writing Don't Tell the Nazis, the first scene ended up about here. And then I wrote the rest of the book backwards, and then I wrote the ending. So what I would suggest when you're writing, don't make yourself think that you have to come up with a good beginning, because it will just freeze you. The other thing is, a really good editing technique is after you've written, say you've written 20 pages, one of the best editing things that you can do is get rid of the first 4 pages and just go, what if I started on page 5? And you'll often see that it's better anyway. So seeing as the first stuff that you write is probably just notes that you need yourself rather than what the reader needs, why get yourself tied up in a knot worrying about whether you're writing something in order? So I like to think of scenes in a book sort of like raindrops. And so you write this one because that was really vivid, and then this one was really vivid, and then this one was really vivid. And after a while, the raindrops become a puddle and you can see the shape of your book. And then you can rearrange, you can copy and paste and put them in other orders, but it just starts to make sense. And then you see the way that your story is going to go. So that's how I start a book.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is from Linda Angwin. Several Ukrainians and their relatives, even today, still feel threatened by Soviets, even after escaping to the US. Do you ever feel any trepidation for your own safety when exposing some of these stories?
Yes, and in fact, I won't post where I'm going on my website or any place public until after I'm not there anymore, for that very same reason. And I'm actually, the book that is being published in the fall is on the Holodomor again. It's a novel. It's the title, I'm hoping they will keep the title, Winter Kill. And it's the biggest novel that I've written. I know I'm going to get into trouble. I've already had the inklings of the trouble that I'm going to get into. I've already had some threats, and I'm just hoping that the threats that I've already had are just not got anything to do with that, and maybe people just don't like me for other reasons. But it always makes me worried because this happens every single time. So I even just wrote a short story that was in a novel, not a novel, it was in an anthology that I did, Kobzar's Children. And there's one short story in here called The Rings, which it's on my website now and anybody can read it. I've taken any kind of permissions off it. You can just print it off and use it. But it's about a young boy escaping from the Holodomor. And when Kobzar's Children went out, the whole thing with the hate and the death threats and everything else had to get the OPP involved. And it was just really terrifying. But the thing is that there are some topics that are just too important to not write about. And so the people who are still fearful of what Putin is doing and also fearful of not being able to speak themselves. See, this is another reason to write fiction rather than nonfiction, because if you're writing about people who are still feeling threatened, and not because they're paranoid, but because it actually happens. You're not paranoid when it's true, right? So when I fictionalize people, it's easier for them to be honest with me with their stories because they know that I protect their anonymity, and I change it enough so that nobody could actually find them.
Thank you. Next question is from Karen and Ivan. Do you access archives in Ukraine for your research for your books?
I don't read Ukrainian well. So what I do is I access researchers rather than the archives in Ukrainian. And I count mostly on people who are in Canada or the US and translations rather than doing things in Ukrainian. My husband is fluent, and I have lots of friends who will translate for me, but this is a weakness of my own that I don't speak Ukrainian. It also has to do with being dyslexic. It's harder to learn another language when you're dyslexic. It's just the way that your brain works.
Next question is from Matab. I apologize if I pronounced it incorrectly. Is there any story you've written that has not yet seen the light of day because you feel you haven't gotten it right, that you might be ready to tell the story correctly at a later time?
There are, yes, and Matab, that's a wonderful question. And Matab Narsimhan has absolutely fabulous books, and you should look for them and get them. One of my favorite of Matab's is The Tiffin. It's an awesome book. So I have been struggling with a book set during the 1500s that in Ukraine and also in Turkey, what's now Turkey, and it's about Roxolana, who was a young girl who was captured into slavery and ends up being the empress of the Ottoman Empire. And so it's a book that I've done a lot of research on, and I keep on setting aside. I just keep on not doing it because I keep on writing things that are more current. But that is a book that I really, really want to write. Another one that I really want to do, and I keep on setting it aside, is I want to write a thriller for adults about a woman who was stalked. And I was stalked when I was in university, actually by two different people. And so I would like to do that, but I just keep on ending up writing these other books, because when you meet actual people who have lived through these times, you want to take the opportunity to interview them while you can, and then their stories just live in your head. And then I have to write it because it's like that pimple that if I don't squeeze, then I'm just not going to be able to sleep at night. So it means that Roxolana keeps on going back in the distance, and then my thriller also goes back in the distance because, you know, it's the research is different because it's something that I went through.
The next question is, do you write with a computer or a typewriter? From Asher, grade 6-7 at Christ the King.
Oh, that's a cool question. You know, I actually have a typewriter in the basement. And when I was in university, I used a typewriter because that's how old I am. And this typewriter that I have, my mom got both my sister and I typewriters from like really old ones, like vintage typewriters. So like I was in university in the 70s and the 80s, but my typewriter that I used when I was in university was from 1915. It's probably worth a lot of money, but I don't use it anymore. And even then I didn't use it very much because it was really hard. And so when I was in university, I would handwrite essays when I could, because I just hated using this typewriter so much. But I use a laptop. That's what I type on, but I take notes with paper. I always have a bunch of steno pads on the go, and because that's how I think. So I will do brainstorming. I'll also like draw a map of my city or like their journey or whatever, and then put years on it and things like that. But I write with a laptop on my lap to pretend that I'm not working, because if I sit at a desk, then it feels too much like work.
The next one is from Oksana. Do you do your own research or do you have someone helping you?
That's a great question. And I would never have anyone else do my research because then I could misunderstand it. And something that I find really frustrating is a lot of adult writers will offload the research. And when I read those books, honestly, I throw them across the room. And something that really bothers me, because I've done such intensive research, especially for World War II, when I read World War II literature that's poorly researched or they've misunderstood something, invariably, you know that it's because they've offloaded their research to someone else. You need to do your own research, and you need to do it really intensively, like you're doing a course in school and you're going to be tested, because you will be tested. And also, when I do my research, I keep track of everything. And I have footnotes all the way through my initial manuscripts so that my publishers know that I've looked it up, I've not made it up. And I give them access to the book if I can, or like a link if I'm able to, so that they can see exactly where it is that I got this information, and that, I haven't put my swing on it, that I am accurately reflecting what the situation is.
Thank you. Next question is from E. Grande. Do you have a favorite author currently? Jonah, grade 8.
So I read widely. Right now I'm reading a book by Susan Juby that I'm really enjoying. It's I don't think it's published yet, but it's called We Three. And it will come out in the next couple of months. And it's about a kid whose father has been accused of a terrible crime, and it's contemporary. And the effect that it has on his life, as he and his mother and sister are actually, they've taken on a different identity and they're living in a different town. So it's really good. Another one of my favorite books more recently is Bird Spell by Valerie Sherrard. This is just a marvelous book. And it's so different from what I write, because Valerie, she's a good friend of mine. She does not write historical fiction. She writes contemporary. She knows how to get into a character's heart. They're real people. And I love what she does. It's authentic writing. And as I mentioned before, the Tiffin, Mahtab Narsimhan, Karen Audio, her Making Seeker, I'm looking forward to it. It's sitting downstairs. We still do this decontamination thing. So it's sitting because it arrived yesterday. And so I'm just decontaminating it, and I'll start it probably tonight.
So Floyd asks, how did being a dyslexic challenge or impede your writing, or did it make you stronger?
That's a great question. And I don't know what it's like to not be dyslexic, but I do know that probably my approach to a lot of things is a little bit different. So one thing that dyslexia does that I consider a real gift is it makes me look at things in a different way than people who don't have that gift. And so I always seem to be never of the same opinion of anyone else in the room, which I think is great, because I think that you need to hear all sides of a story, and you also need to take everything into consideration when you're going to write something. But I never assume that what I think or know is the end of the conversation. I think that being dyslexic forces you to be open-minded about all the possibilities of a story and life. And so one thing that readers have told me that they really like about my stories is that even the minor characters have nuance. And I think that's because in my life, being a dyslexic and being labeled slow and all that, I was a minor character. Like, people just kind of wrote me off, right? And so I have great faith in the people that other people are ignoring, that they have a valid story too. And that's also the way that I choose my stories, is I choose the people who have been ignored before and write stories about them. And it's because I feel that I was ignored. Especially when I was a child, people just thought that they knew all about me, that they could sum me up. And as soon as you think you can sum up another person, you're wrong.
So another question from Stephen Stone's Community School from Sam. When you were writing your books, do you feel a personal connection with your characters?
Yes, I do. You have to, because otherwise, how can you come to the table and write for that length of time? When I was writing Traitors Among Us, it's dedicated to my sisters. So I have an older sister and 2 younger sisters. And sometimes we don't get along. I don't know. Like, do you ever have that experience where you're really annoyed with your siblings? Well, we were annoyed with each other for a while. And it happened to be while I was writing this book. And that really informed the way that I was writing. But it also helped me understand the characters too. So it was kind of neat, because you can take your own life and you can infuse your characters with parts of it, and also use your characters as a problem-solving technique. I don't know, I probably didn't answer that question at all, but the whole thing about writing is it's just such a personal thing. And I also do this thing that every single character has pieces of various people that I love, and also people that really irritate me in them. So like the character of Sophie in Traitors Among Us, who was the Hitler girl, she's sort of the embodiment of a lot of people who really bug me. And boy, was it satisfying to write her. It's actually more satisfying to write icky people than it is to write nice people. But also, like at the very end of this book, there is a cat, and her name is Minwee, and that's my oldest sister's cat. So I had to put her in because Minwee was really mad at me when I was helping my sister when she was away, and I didn't put the kitty litter in her kitty litter box. She was really mad at me. So I had to make it up to her by putting her in the book.
Sorry, actually, I just want to cut in for a minute here. We have a few questions. We'll answer those because we are actually running out of time. So we'll answer those, but we can't take any new questions at the moment, okay? All right, go ahead, Val.
So from Donna Young, what is your all-time favorite book?
So my all-time favorite book that I have read would have to be Oliver Twist, and it's because it taught me how to read. Way back then, when I discovered reading and I read Oliver Twist, then I went on to read all of Charles Dickens' books that the Brantford Public Library had, and I also decided that I was going to try and read every single big fat novel in the Brantford Public Library in alphabetical order of authors' names. And I was very fortunate that many books were put in, were filed. So I ended up reading The Diary of Anne Frank, even though I was only at the D's because someone put it in as diary. I also read the Freddie the Pig books by Walter Brooks. As I say, all the Charles Dickens books, Louisa May Alcott, because she was A. So by the time I got to grade 8, I had still only read to the D's, but thankfully, you know, many people misfiled them. It's really hard for someone like me who is an omnivore for books to choose a favorite. But if I had to, if I was on a desert island and I could only have one book, it would be Oliver Twist.
Great choice. Next, we have from Sharon Jennings. Do you have a routine for taking care of yourself when writing these difficult stories? Great question.
That is a good question. And Sharon Jennings, it's so nice to see you. Sharon Jennings was shortlisted for the Governor General Award and is a phenomenal writer and has written over 60 books. And so I very strongly suggest that you read some of her books as well. So one thing that I do is I go to the gym a lot. And I like that I can now go in person again. And I also do long walks. And I read for pleasure. I read every night for at least an hour before I go to bed. So those are some of the things that I do just as self-care. My husband is, he really looks after me. And so when I'm in the middle of writing, he doesn't like to talk to me because he knows that I'll be in a bad mood. And so like we have this thing, like if I say busy, he knows not even to talk to me, but he will approach me gently and he'll go like this. And what this means is, do you want me to make you a cup of tea? Which I always go, yes, a cup of tea. And then the other thing that he does is he will bring me the perfect boiled egg in the middle of when I'm writing. So these things keep me sane.
Just so you know, Marsha, we're getting lots of chats saying, thank you so much. This was wonderful. We have to run. So just wanted to make sure you knew that. You're getting so much positive feedback and thank yous. Mrs. Baker's class has 3 questions. I'm going to read them out to you. So number 1 is, have you ever gotten emotional while interviewing people for your stories? Number 2 is, who influenced you to write, which I think maybe you've kind of answered. And number 3 is, which one of your books would you recommend for a grade 7 student?
So I'm going to answer it backwards because I am dyslexic after all. So for a grade 7 student, if they haven't read any of my books yet, they should start with Making Bombs for Hitler, because the feedback that I get is that is a book that makes someone from a so-so reader into a passionate reader. So that is the one that I would start with. As in terms of who inspired me to write, I would have to say it was my mom. My mom passed away just a year ago. My mom raised my sister and I after my parents split up. And she was a passionate reader herself, but she was also a big believer in me. And even when I failed 4th grade, she looked at my report card, which you can see on my website, by the way. It's Calla, CALLA.com, and go to awards. I put my grade 4 report card there because it was just as important as any award I ever got. But she looked at that award where I had failed practically everything, but I got an A in art. And she said, look at this, you have such a great imagination, and you are just so talented, and you are so creative. I am so proud of you. She didn't mention all the red circles of all the subjects that I failed. And my mother was also the person who always was my first reader for everything that I wrote. She had Alzheimer's. She died of Alzheimer's. And so even when she had Alzheimer's, what I was doing during the pandemic was I would have a Skype visit with her, and I would read chapters of the books that she and I had worked on together. And yes, I do get emotional when I interview people who end up in my books, and I have wept openly in front of people as I'm interviewing them. And I think that that's only a fair thing to do because they're opening up to me. And if I don't have the empathy to listen to what they went through with my own open heart, then I don't have the right to write the stories. Now, you still have to do a book draw.
Yes, we do. And I'm worried that people are leaving. So I'm just going to interject and tell you all about the draw now. Well, it's not necessarily a draw. Marsha has given the library 5 signed books to give away. And so the first 5 people to come into the library in Brantford at the main branch will get a free copy of the book once they tell us the secret phrase, which is, "The secrets are in the stacks." So if you come into the library and say that you've attended this event and say the secrets are in the stacks, you'll get a free copy, the first 5 people, okay?
Autographed, and it's autographed.
Yes, it's autographed as well. Okay, and also, if you want to purchase an autographed copy of the book, you can go, it's on sale at, my apologies here, Green Heron Books, yes, in Paris. Yes. So if you're interested in purchasing an autographed copy there, you can do that there as well. Okay.
And the books are available in any, you should be able to get them in your library, your local public library, school library. Scholastic Book Fair sells them, Scholastic sells them, and also any bookstore. But I encourage you to use an independent bookstore because they are really struggling because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have some teachers saying their students really enjoyed the session. We do have a few more questions. What do you say? Would you like to answer the last few here?
How about if they're short, sure, but anybody who feels that they didn't get their question answered, please tweet me. My Twitter is at Marsha Skrypuch, just my first name and last name. And I would love to answer you by Twitter because that way other people who had the same question will get it as well. But I'm happy to answer 2 more questions.
Okay. Val, do we have some short ones that we can?
Yeah, we do. Mrs. Baker's grade 7, what is the longest novel you have wrote?
The one that I just finished writing, Winter Kill, which I don't know how many pages it'll end up being, but probably over 300.
And then we have from grade 6, Christ a King. Henry would like to know, have you ever read the story Refugee? There's no author listed, but.
Well, that is Alan Gratz, and he actually gave me a quote on making bombs for Hitler. And I have not read Refugee. It's actually sitting right there. And the reason that it's right there. The reason that I haven't read it is because I know that he and I have similar writing techniques. And so while I'm actively writing, I cannot read someone who has similar narrative techniques to me because I could unconsciously incorporate them. So I am anxious to read his books, and I have most of them, but I cannot read them yet. It's the same thing. I can't read anything set during World War II. If it's a novel, if I'm writing about World War II, I restrict myself to research reading.
We'll go ahead and stop the questions there then and encourage everyone to go on Twitter and social media and get them answered there as well.
Thank you so much. It was great to see all of you, and have a wonderful day.